Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we're getting into something really interesting, a political movement that managed to pull off a kind of quiet, almost invisible revolution.
That's right. It was meticulous, very middle class, actually, and incredibly intellectual. So much so that it often gets missed in the usual stories about radical change.
We are talking about the Fabian Society.
Exactly. Forget the usual images, barricades in the streets, fiery speeches. This was more like a drawing room society. They often met in pretty obscure little places.
Little groups, right?
Very small initially. But they carefully, and I think successfully, laid the groundwork for what we now see as modern collectivism, social democracy, certainly in Britain. It's a fascinating paradox, really, in British political history.
Okay, so our sources for this deep dive, they take us right back to the start, the origins, and those crucial first few decades. We're looking at roughly 1883 through to the lead up to World War I.
Precisely. And our goal here, our mission, if you like, is to really unpack their core strategies, the quiet, very pragmatic, sometimes maybe even ruthless methods this tiny group of intellectuals used.
Methods they used to take socialism from being this fringe idea, often seen as foreign and suspicious,
Very much mistrusted.
and turn it into something central, almost undeniable in British political life.
Yeah, to really get a feel for how they started, you kind of have to picture the atmosphere in the early 1880s. Our sources paint 1882 as this time of, apparent calm.
On the surface, anyhow.
Absolutely. Big journals, like The Spectator, were saying things like, Britain as a whole never was more tranquil and happy. Economically, the Treasury was doing well, lots of capital floating around.
And people were distracted by, what? Electric lights?
Pretty much. That and minor political scandals like Mr. Bradlaugh refusing the parliamentary oath. Surface stuff, really.
But that outward calm, it's the perfect backdrop, isn't it, for the huge intellectual shifts happening just underneath.
That's the key. While the politicians were busy with day-to-day issues, the younger generation, the ones who'd formed the Fabians, they were grappling with the fallout from Darwin.
The Origin of Species had come out back in 1859, but the older political establishment just wasn't engaging with it.
Not really, no. They sort of ignored it. But for these young thinkers, evolution wasn't theory, it was just fact. And it forced them to rethink everything about society. You had figures like Herbert Spencer talking about evolution's massive significance.
And T.H. Huxley using that new scientific thinking to, poke fun at established figures.
Exactly. He famously ridiculed Gladstone's simple-minded credulity, applying this rigorous new scientific standard to politics.
So you've got this generation feeling a bit adrift, intellectually, cut off from the old moral and religious hankers of their parents.
Precisely. They were searching for a new way to structure society, a new framework. And that intellectual detachment, that search, is what made them so open to completely new ideas, things beyond just traditional liberalism or conservatism.
Okay, so that sets the scene. This hunger for solutions, especially around poverty, but solutions that weren't just about, asking people to be nicer.
Right, they'd seen that fail.
Yeah.
Which brings us to the sort of intellectual crucible where the society was born. And the initial spark, surprisingly, it didn't come from Europe, it came from America.
Henry George. His book, Progress and Poverty from 1879. Why was that specific book so impactful over here?
Well, the sources call it a new gospel. That's quite a term. It wasn't just diagnosing poverty. It offered a clear, definite solution that relied on political action.
Not just moral appeals or charity.
Exactly. Before George, most reformers were stuck in that mode. Ethical appeals, the church, a strategy the Fabians later dryly noted Christianity had tried and failed with for, 19 centuries? George just cut through all that.
And his solution was the single tax. Taxing land rent.
Specifically, taxing the rent of English land essentially out of existence. It was a tangible legislative proposal. That was the key difference.
And it particularly appealed to the educated middle class, people with a bit of time and education, to think beyond just making a living.
Yes, that was the core audience. It gave them an intellectual way in, not just an emotional one, a path to change based on reason and policy.
Now, the Fabians eventually moved beyond George's specific land tax idea, right? They saw it wasn't the whole picture.
Correct. They realized land rent was only one part of England's wealth. But the fundamental message stuck. Poverty wasn't inevitable. It was an evil that the state, properly organized, could and should abolish. That realization just changed the whole political game.
And amid all this ferment, the really striking thing is who wasn't influential at this stage? Karl Marx.
It's remarkable, isn't it? He died in London, March 1883, right when these groups were forming. And the sources say, quite bluntly, nobody in England was then aware that the greatest figure in international politics had passed away.
He was basically unknown in English political circles.
Virtually. Lived in England for decades, but his major works weren't translated, and crucially, he just never clicked with the English working-class leaders. The Fabian founders, even the big names who joined slightly later, they hadn't read Das Kapital. They weren't Marxists.
And that lack of Marxist dogma was actually important for them.
Hugely important, perhaps the single most critical factor. It gave them the freedom, the flexibility to develop their own distinctly English kind of socialism, rooted in British context, not imported theory.
So the immediate trigger for the society wasn't Marx, it wasn't even George directly, but an ethical discussion group, the Fellowship of the New Life.
That was the incubator, yes, founded by Thomas Davidson. Their idea was utopia through personal moral improvement. If individuals, especially capitalists, became morally better, society would fix itself.
A noble idea, but...
But the key figures quickly realized it was a dead end. Trying to moralize capitalists hadn't worked for centuries. So the crucial split happened in October 1883.
What was the split?
A faction decided that pure ethical striving wasn't enough. You needed practical, economic, and crucially political action to actually reconstruct society. That breakaway group, that was the Fabian Society.
Okay. And right from the start, they had this aim: rebuilding society on non-competitive lines to tackle poverty. Their first publication, track number 1, Why Are the Many Poor?, drafted by the only actual working-class member initially, W.L. Phillips, that already showed their strategic thinking.
Oh, absolutely. It was a masterclass in early political branding. It laid out the core ideas of collectivism, but, and this is key, it deliberately avoided using the word socialism.
Why? Too scary for the public.
Probably. It showed their pragmatism right away. They were committed to the goal, but totally flexible on the language needed to sell it. Radical pragmatism from day one.
And this idea of careful timing, strategy, is baked right into their name, isn't it?
Yeah.
From the Roman general Fabius Cunctator, the delayer.
Exactly. The motto, which Frank Podmore apparently came up with, sums it up perfectly. For the right moment, you must wait. But when the time comes, you must strike hard.
So the waiting wasn't laziness.
Not at all. It wasn't fear either. They openly admitted they didn't know exactly how to achieve their goals yet. They needed time for taking counsel, for research. The sources mention their initial lack of self-confidence, unusual amongst revolutionaries. Delay was essential preparation. Rigorous, necessary research.
Okay, so they've established the why, the need for action, and the when, wait, research, then strike. Now, the crucial next phase seems to be about the who and the how. This brings us into the mid-1880s, when some key personalities arrive.
Yes, this is when the society really transforms from just a talking shop into a serious intellectual powerhouse. Bernard Shaw, showing up in May 1884, was like an electric shock.
In what way?
He immediately brought this sharp wit, intellectual precision, and sheer argumentative force. He steered them away from any lingering, high-minded moral idealism towards hard analysis.
And his first contribution, pamphlet number 2, a manifesto, set that tone immediately.
It really did. It wasn't vague ethical stuff. It put forward specific, quite radical concepts. Things like everyone having a birthright life interest in national wealth. Essentially, an equal share in the nation's industry and prosperity. And it directly challenged the core capitalist belief that private enterprise was the best or only way to drive invention or distribute wealth fairly. It just rejected that premise outright.
And then came the organizational muscle, Sidney Webb and Sidney Olivier.
Webb especially. He was the engine, the indispensable organizer. He and Olivier brought this systematic, almost you could say bureaucratic rigor to the society.
Bureaucratic in a good way.
In the sense of being methodical. They insisted that if you want to reconstruct society, you can't just rely on passion or abstract ideas. You need facts. Hard, verifiable data, relentless, sober research. That became their weapon.
And they showed this off pretty quickly at the Industrial Remuneration Conference in 1885.
Yes, that was a big public debut for their approach. It was a serious conference funded by a wealthy donor tackling the central question: when the nation gets richer, who actually benefits? The capitalists or the workers?
A pretty fundamental question.
Absolutely. And while the debate itself was quite serious, the thing historians always remember is Shaw's first big speech there. It really crystallized the Fabian style.
The joke about the burglars.
That's the one. He apologized to any burglars in the audience for lumping them in with the modern capitalist class, basically implying that capitalists were just a more socially acceptable form of thief.
It's a witty line, but what was the point? Strategically.
It was crucial. It established their brand. Clever, witty, intellectually superior, using sophisticated rhetoric instead of the sort of heavy-handed revolutionary slogans you heard from other socialist groups. It made them seem smart and capable, not just, as the source puts it, gushing enthusiasts.
Okay, so they've got the intellectual firepower, the research method, the witty style. Then came a really key strategic shift, didn't it? Moving away from grand national theories towards something much more local. Municipal socialism.
Yes, gas and water socialism, as it was sometimes called. A bit dismissively at first, this was pure revolutionary pragmatism.
Why the shift?
They looked at the national leaders, Gladstone, Salisbury, and saw they just weren't interested in these deep social problems. National change looked impossible. But local government, parish vestries, school boards, the new county councils, that was different.
Untapped potential.
Huge potential. They realized that by focusing on things everyone used, gas, water, trams, eventually housing, they could take control of local monopolies, run them collectively, and demonstrate that public ownership could be efficient and beneficial. Proof of concept, basically.
And their publications started reflecting this focus.
Immediately. Facts for Londoners in 1889, just pages and pages of dense statistics became the go-to handbook for anyone involved in London's local politics. Then, the London program in 1891 offered actual policy blueprints.
So they became the data providers for local reform.
Exactly. Opponents might have sneered at gas and water, but this fact-based approach made the Fabians indispensable. If a local politician, liberal or Tory, needed to understand transport policy or public health stats, who had done the homework? The Fabians. They effectively professionalized the process of local reform.
This whole foundational period seems to culminate in their big literary statement, Fabian Essays in Socialism in 1889, which was, considering how small they still were, a massive success.
An absolute intellectual blockbuster, sold incredibly well, over 46,000 copies, just in English editions. And significantly, the authors gave all the rights and profits straight back to the society to fund more work.
What was the core message that resonated so strongly?
It wasn't about fiery revolution. The genius of the essays was arguing that socialism wasn't some scary foreign import. It was the next logical, inevitable step in Britain's own social and political development.
Building on existing institutions, not smashing them.
Precisely. It framed socialism as gradual, organic, almost historically determined evolution, growing naturally out of British traditions. It took the revolutionary sting out of the word socialism.
And this is where they formally broke with Marx, intellectually.
Explicitly. The essays embraced mainstream British economic thinking, the kind taught in universities, not Marxist abstract economics. They rejected the revolutionary language, the proletariat, the bourgeoisie. They anchored their ideas firmly in British soil, offering a path to change that didn't require tearing everything down first.
Okay, so the Fabian Essays laid the intellectual groundwork. But how did they plan to actually get these ideas turned into law? That takes us to their famous strategy. Permeation.
Permeation was the key operational tactic. It literally meant soaking through, permeating existing political structures with Fabian ideas.
So instead of building their own party.
Right. Instead of spending decades trying to build a separate socialist party to fight the liberals and conservatives, they decided to inject their research, their policy ideas, their specific legislative blueprints directly into those existing parties and into the growing trade union movement, too.
Why not just join the more explicitly revolutionary groups, like the Social Democratic Federation, the SDF?
Well, the contrast was pretty stark. The SDF was all about strict Marxist dogma and, frankly, talk of violent revolution rifles and barricades, that sort of rhetoric.
Which the Fabians found unrealistic.
Unrealistic and, personally, quite repellent. Remember, these were mostly middle-class professionals, civil servants, writers, clerks. Their day jobs required a certain level of discretion. Quiet, research-based lobbying fit their lives. Street protests and revolutionary agitation didn't. Permeation suited their social position and their temperament.
But wasn't there an ethical question here? If they started out with high ideals, how did they justify this?
Well, it sounds a bit manipulative, doesn't it? taking advantage of party dissensions between the unsocialists, as the source puts it.
Look, it was undeniably calculated. Pure political pragmatism. Shaw, Webb, they would argue the ethical goal of fairer society justified the practical, even cynical means needed to achieve legislative change in the real world.
Do they have examples of other approaches failing?
Oh, yes. They learned a hard lesson from the Tory gold scandal back in 1885.
What was that?
The SDF, desperate for influence, actually took money from the Conservatives to run candidates against Liberals in a few places. The idea was to split the anti-Tory vote.
How did that work out?
It was a disaster. It failed miserably, achieved nothing, and permanently damaged the SDF's credibility. Made them look like they could be bought. The Fabians saw that and concluded their strength lay in being the indispensable ideas people, the quiet influencers, not a third force easily manipulated or dismissed.
Be the brains, not the brawn, essentially. Something like that. Be the policy engine. Now, you mentioned the trade unions. Initially, the Fabian essays were actually a bit cool, even hostile towards the unions and the cooperative movement.
But that changed.
Dramatically. The big London dock strike in 1889 was a real wake-up call.
How so?
It just showed the raw power of organized, unskilled labor in a way the middle-class Fabians hadn't fully grasped. They'd underestimated it, so they pivoted quite quickly.
From abstract theory to practical help.
Exactly. They started focusing on drafting actual legislation that unions wanted. The 8 Hours Day campaign was a big focus for them.
Though their specific plan wasn't always popular with the unions themselves.
True. Their trade option proposal was seen as too moderate by some more militant unions. But the key thing was the Fabians became the go-to people for turning broad demands into workable, legally sound bills. They had the technical expertise.
And they got some early wins, like the Fair Wages Clause.
Yes, they pointed to that as an early success. Getting the London School Board, thanks to Fabians like Annie Besant and Stuart Headlam, to insist on fair wages in its contracts back in 1888. That was tangible administrative socialism making a difference.
Okay, but the really big test of permeation was trying to influence the major parties, especially the Liberals, right?
Absolutely. That was the main game. Sidney Webb sending his paper wanted a program privately to key liberal figures was a classic Fabian move.
And their strategy was quite deliberate, wasn't it? Figure out what people should want, then make it look like they do want it.
The source is pretty explicit about that, yes. Use skillful agitation, provide the arguments, the data to shape public and political opinion towards the policies they, the experts, had determined were necessary based on their research.
And it worked with the Newcastle program.
It certainly seemed to. Their ideas significantly influenced the Liberal Party's platform adopted at Newcastle in 1891. Key collectivist policies got embedded right into mainstream liberal thinking. That was peak permeation of the Liberals.
But that phase didn't last forever.
No, things shifted again after the 1892 election. In 1893, the Society published this really quite scathing manifesto.
What did it say?
It basically told working-class voters to give up on the Liberal Party, to abandon it and form their own distinct trade union-based political party.
Wow. That's years before the Labour Party actually formed.
Incredibly prescient. The manifesto even outlined a structure, suggesting funding for 50 candidates. It caused a bit of internal strife. Some Fabians were too tied to the Liberals, but it showed the Society was now confident enough to push for independent labor representation. They weren't just permeating anymore. They were actively trying to build the vehicle for their policies.
A significant evolution in their strategy. So moving into the early 1900s, they faced some major external challenges that really tested their core principles, particularly nonpartisanship.
Definitely. The Boer War, starting around 1900, created a massive internal crisis. It directly challenged that core Fabian idea of staying neutral on issues like foreign policy or war things, which socialism cannot solve and does not touch, as they put it.
Because many members felt they had to take a side.
Yes, prominent figures, J. Ramsay MacDonald, who'd later lead Labor, Will Crooks, Walter Crane, they argued passionately that the Society had a moral duty to oppose aggressive capitalism and militarism, to align with international socialist anti-war positions.
So it was a battle between the idealists and the pragmatists again.
Exactly. The leadership, the old gang, like Shaw and Webb, fought back hard. They argued that taking an official stance on the war, whatever it was, would shatter the society's unique position. It would destroy their ability to influence policy across party lines. They insisted on corporate neutrality,
And they put it to a vote.
a rare postal ballot of all members, and the leadership's position neutrality won, but only just.
How close was it?
Very close. 259 votes against issuing a pronouncement, 217 in favor. The sources say that narrow win basically saved the society from splitting apart right then and there, though quite a few of the idealists did resign anyway. Efficiency trumped idealism.
Yet, right after voting not to take a stance, they published a major statement on imperial policy, Fabianism, and the empire, mainly written by Shaw. That seems contradictory.
Classic Fabianism. Stay officially neutral on the morality of the specific war, but use the situation to inject their own distinct, rationalist policy framework for how the empire should be run.
And what was that framework?
It was pretty radical, quite shocking, really. Shaw argued that the only legitimate basis for any nation holding territory, especially within an empire, was efficiency, making proper, adequate use of that territory for the good of the whole world community.
So not based on history or conquest or nationalism, but on efficient administration.
Precisely. The manifesto baldly stated that the state which obstructs international civilization will have to go, be it big or little. It implied that intervention, even taking over territory, could be justified purely on the grounds of administrative competence and maximizing global welfare.
That's taking the Webb's obsession with rational administration to a global, almost ruthless level.
It really is. It shows how, for the core Fabians, technical expertise and rational efficiency were seen as higher values than traditional ethics or nationalism, even when it came to something as huge as empire.
This focus on efficiency, even if it meant upsetting allies, seems to explain their controversial stance on education policy a couple of years later, too.
Absolutely. The Education Act of 1902 and 1903, the Society, led by Webb, actively supported the conservative government's policy.
Which put them completely at odds with their usual allies, the liberals, and the emerging labor movement.
Totally against them. Liberals and labor hated these acts, saw them as anti-democratic, pro-Church of England. But Webb didn't care about the politics.
Why support the conservatives then?
Because he saw the core of the policy transferring control from lots of small, often inefficient local school boards to larger, more centralized county councils as a vital step towards greater administrative efficiency in education. For Webb, if the policy was structurally rational and efficient, it didn't matter which party proposed it. They had to back it.
And they even managed to tweak the legislation.
They did. They got about 11 specific amendments they drafted inserted into the final London Education Bill. It's a perfect example. Ignore party politics, focus on implementing technically sound, efficient policy.
And the peak of this Webb-led administrative influence has to be the Poor Law Commission work, culminating in the Minority Report in 1909.
Oh, that was monumental. Beatrice Webb got appointed to the Royal Commission, and she and Sidney essentially produced this alternative report, the Minority Report. It was a devastating, incredibly detailed critique of the whole Victorian poor law system.
And it wasn't just criticism, it offered solutions.
A complete blueprint, really, for restructuring how society dealt with poverty, unemployment, destitution, abolishing the old punitive poor law and replacing it with preventative social services. The society knew this document was pure gold, policy-wise.
And they had to make sure people actually read it, which led to a fight over copyright.
Yes, a brilliant little example of their bureaucratic savvy. The government's lawyers, the Treasury solicitor, tried to claim Crown copyright, which would have restricted the Fabians' ability to print and distribute the report cheaply and widely.
Which would have killed their campaign to get it adopted.
Exactly. But the Fabians, probably Webb digging through precedents, found an earlier Treasury ruling that allowed them to publish it freely. They won that fight and then aggressively marketed the Minority Report. It shows they weren't just policy wonks. They understood the practicalities of political campaigning and how to navigate the system, even the legal fine print.
Okay, so by the late 1900s, they're highly influential behind the scenes, but maybe the society itself had become a bit small, maybe a bit stagnant. This brings us to the H.G. Wells episode.
Ah, yes, the Great Disruption. H.G. Wells joining around 1906 was like throwing a bomb into the quiet Fabian drawing room.
He wasn't impressed with their low-key approach.
Not at all. He wrote this paper, Faults of the Fabian, which was brutally critical. He mocked their little dribble of activities, their meetings in obscure underground apartments. He wanted, in his words, Imaginative megalomania.
Meaning?
He wanted them to become a mass movement, aim for 10,000 members, professionalize their operations, get loud, get visible, and completely rewrite their old, somewhat stuffy constitutional basis.
And the chaos this caused actually ended up boosting the society.
Ironically, yes. The internal debates, the arguments, the sheer energy of the conflict massively revitalized the group. Membership shot up from around 730 in 1904 to nearly 2,500 by 1909.
They couldn't fit in the usual meeting rooms.
Exactly. They were forced into larger halls. The fight basically put them on the map in a new way.
And the core of the fight was Wells versus the old gang. Shaw, Webb, Olivier.
Very much so. It was partly personality, Wells's charismatic, impatient vision versus Shaw's debating skill and the old gang's defense of their established methods. But it was also a fundamental clash of strategies.
Mass movement versus elite influence.
Precisely. Wells saw a moment for rapid popular expansion. The old gang argued that their strength lay in being a small, expert core, doing the hard research and maintaining the discretion needed for permeation. Diluting that with mass membership, they feared, would destroy their unique value.
And Shaw essentially out-argued Wells.
He outmaneuvered him, certainly. Through clever procedural tactics and sheer debating prowess, Shaw managed to rally support for amendments that effectively preserved the old gang's control and the core Fabian method of incremental, expert-driven reform.
But Wells's agitation wasn't completely fruitless. There was one significant change to their constitution.
That's right. Amidst all the failed proposals, one key addition did get made to the basis. The phrase explicitly enforcing equal citizenship of men and women.
A nod to the growing suffragist movement.
Absolutely. It was a clear victory for the society's own increasingly active women's group, led by people like Maud Pember Reeves. It showed that while the core method was defended, the old gang could be pushed to update the society's stated goals when faced with strong, practical, well-articulated political pressure from within.
Wells eventually gave up and resigned.
He did in 1908. He was frustrated. He disagreed with keeping the old basis, especially the fuzzy wording on compensation if private property was taken over. He also felt the society was too vague on issues like the family and childcare, calling their vision of socialism a miserable perversion without addressing those properly.
He wanted grand visions. They offered detailed plans.
Exactly. Wells wanted romance and revolution, even if intellectual. The Fabians offered meticulous, often dry, technical administration. They stuck to their guns. Permeation, expertise, gradualism.
So looking back over these foundational decades, what's the final verdict on the Fabian method? What did they really achieve, according to the historical account?
Well, the core achievement, and it's profound, was freeing English socialism from what the source calls the intellectual bondage to Marxism.
How so?
They created a compelling native argument. They showed that public ownership and control of industry didn't have to mean violent revolution. It could be presented as the next logical, inevitable step in Britain's own social evolution, achieved through careful policy and technical governance.
And the source compares their influence to the Benthamites earlier.
Yes, it's a really useful comparison. Like the utilitarians influenced policy from behind the scenes. The Fabians succeeded not so much by making socialists in terms of party members,
but by making socialism in terms of actual policy, getting their ideas implemented regardless of who was in power.
That's the absolute key takeaway. Their real impact, especially on the big social reforms after 1906, things like social insurance, labor regulations, came from being this small circle of thinkers in quiet touch with politicians. They were the indispensable source of facts, the people who wrote the blueprints.
But the historian providing our source material adds a significant caveat, right? A sense of unfinished business.
Yes, a critical point. Despite all the policy wins, graduated income tax, fair wages clauses, national insurance, taking local services into public hands, the original fundamental goal stated in their basis.
The extinction of private ownership of land and industrial capital.
That remains largely untouched. They ameliorated the worst effects of capitalism, they built safety nets, they regulated industry. But because they generally favored compensating owners when industries were nationalized or regulated,
The system itself wasn't fundamentally altered.
exactly. Private capital ownership, the source concludes, has barely been touched. Capitalists were compensated, and the system, though modified, continues to flourish. So the incremental pragmatic path was hugely successful in achieving reforms, but it hasn't yet delivered that root and branch reconstruction of property ownership they originally set out to achieve.
So wrapping this up, we've traced how this small, intensely intellectual group wielded immense political influence. They did it by prioritizing efficiency over dogma, research over rhetoric, and that strategy of permeation over direct confrontation. It's really the definitive case study in radical pragmatism.
It truly is. Their success wasn't built on mass appeal or charismatic leaders in the traditional sense. It was built on becoming the essential source of expert guidance, the providers of policy detail. They managed to square that circle, reconciling democratic control with a kind of expert-led administrative efficiency the Webbs championed.
And that brings us, as always, to a final provocative thought for you, our listeners, to chew on. The Fabian method, as we've seen, depends entirely on the slow, careful cultivation of opinion, backed by deep research delivered by patient experts.
A long game.
So the question is, in our world today characterized by, information overload, lightning-fast populist movements, and often a real suspicion of experts in established institutions, does modern democracy still have the patience for the Fabian approach?
That is the crucial tension, isn't it? The Fabians worked tirelessly to replace what they saw as empty revolutionary phraseology with hard facts, complex data, and nuanced policy.
Right.
But what happens if the public or the political system itself loses the ability or the willingness to engage with that complexity? If immediate emotional appeals consistently win out over long-term, fact-based, maybe less exciting solutions?
Then the kind of quiet, rational revolution the Fabians represented might struggle to be heard.
It could even be drowned out entirely, potentially leaving the field open once again to the very kind of simplistic, potentially catastrophic rhetoric and impulsive policymaking they dedicated themselves to overcoming. It's a sobering thought.
Indeed it is. A challenge for us all to consider as we navigate today's political landscape. Thank you. That was a fascinating journey through the history of these quiet revolutionaries.
My pleasure. It's a story worth knowing.
And thank you all for joining us. See you next time on The Deep Dive.